I found the bank statement folded inside a shoebox in the back of our closet, and in that single moment, 13 years of my marriage turned into a lie I was only now learning to read. My name is Renee, I'm 41 years old, and until 3 weeks ago, I believed my husband Mark and I were a team. We weren't rich, we weren't struggling either. We were the kind of comfortable that meant grocery budgets, and secondhand, and a vacation every couple of years if we saved hard enough. At least, that's what he told me. That's what he let me believe every single day for over a decade. The shoebox had $412,000 worth of statements in it. Not spent, not stolen. Saved, hidden. While I was clipping coupons and picking up extra shifts at the hospital. While I was telling our daughter Emma we couldn't afford dance camp this year. My husband had been quietly funneling thousands of dollars a month into an account I never knew existed. I want to tell you how I found it, because I still don't fully understand how I missed it for so long. But first, I need you to understand who we were before that shoebox changed everything, because I didn't realize that was only the beginning. Mark and I met when I was 26, working the night shift as a labor and delivery nurse, running on coffee and adrenaline. He was an accountant then, quiet, steady, the kind of man who remembered how you took your coffee after the first time you mentioned it. He noticed things. That was what drew me to him at first. How observant he was, how he seemed to actually listen when I talked instead of just waiting for his turn to speak. My mother used to say Mark was safe, and she didn't mean it as an insult. She meant it as the highest compliment a mother could give a daughter who dated her share of men who weren't. We got married 2 years later in my aunt's backyard. String lights strung between oak trees, 40 guests, and a cake my sister baked herself because we couldn't afford a bakery one. I didn't care. I remember standing there in a dress I'd altered myself, looking at Mark's face, thinking I had found the one person in the world who would never let me down. He cried during his vows. I remember being surprised by that, because Mark wasn't a man who showed much on the surface. I took it as proof of how deeply he felt things, even when he didn't say so out loud. Emma came 4 years into the marriage. Then Caleb, 2 years after that. Mark switched jobs when Caleb was born, moved from the accounting firm to a position at a logistics company that he said paid less but had better hours for a young family. I remember being proud of him for making that choice. I remember telling my sister he put us first. I actually said those words, put us first. For the next several years, our life took the shape that so many lives take. Mortgage payments, school fundraisers. Mark coaching Caleb's Little League team on Saturday mornings, still in his work clothes, because he'd come straight from a half-day shift. Family dinners where Emma would tell long, meandering stories about her day, and Mark would listen like she was reciting Shakespeare. Sunday mornings with pancakes he insisted on making himself, even though he always burned the first one and gave it to the dog we didn't have, just to make Caleb laugh. From the outside, I imagine we looked like exactly what we were supposed to be. Steady, content. But looking back now, there were things, small things. Things I explained away so easily that I'm almost ashamed of how easy it was. Mark managed our finances. That was our arrangement from the beginning. I worked 12-hour shifts at the hospital. And by the time I got home, the last thing I wanted to do was sit down and reconcile a budget. Mark liked spreadsheets. He liked control, though I never would have used that word back then. I would have said he was organized or responsible. He handled the bills, the mortgage, our modest retirement contributions, and every month he'd give me a number. This is what we have. This is what we can spend. This is what we're saving. I never once asked to see the actual accounts. Why would I? I trusted him with our life. I used to joke with my coworkers at the hospital that Mark was the family CFO, and I was just grateful someone else wanted the job. We laughed about it in the break room over cold coffee between deliveries. I had no idea how differently that joke would sound to me one day. There was a year, when Emma was 8, that I wanted to take the kids to Florida to see my mother, who just had hip surgery and couldn't travel. Mark said we couldn't afford the flights that year. That money was tight because of a car repair and a slow quarter at his company. I remember feeling guilty for even asking. I remember apologizing to him, actually apologizing for suggesting it. I picked up extra weekend shifts for 2 months so we could go the following spring instead, working doubles on my supposed days off while Mark stayed home with the kids, telling me how proud he was of how hard I worked for our family. There was the year Caleb needed braces, and Mark said insurance would only cover part of it. So I started skipping my own dermatologist appointments to help cover the difference. There was a mole on my shoulder I'd been meaning to have checked for almost 3 years by that point. I remember telling myself it was fine. I remember telling myself a lot of things were fine. There was the year I wanted to go back to school for my nurse practitioner license, a 2-year program that would have eventually doubled my salary and given me the kind of career stability I'd always quietly wanted. Mark sat me down at the kitchen table one evening, after the kids were asleep, took my hands in his, and told me gently that we simply couldn't carry the loss of my income for that long, not with 2 kids and a mortgage and Caleb starting travel baseball that spring. He said it so kindly. He said it like a man who had run the numbers 100 times and hated every version of the answer. I cried in the bathroom that night, quietly, so he wouldn't hear, running the shower so the sound would cover it. Then I let the idea go. I told myself it was the responsible thing to do. I told myself Mark was thinking of our family's stability, not just his own comfort. I even thanked him, weeks later, for being honest with me, instead of letting me chase something we couldn't afford. I have replayed that conversation so many times since finding that shoebox, sat at the kitchen table, took my hands, told me we couldn't afford it. We could afford it. We could have afforded it 4 times over. What I didn't know, what I had no reason to suspect, was that every excuse, every tightened belt, every sacrifice I quietly made for the sake of our family's financial security was feeding an account with my name nowhere on it. There were smaller moments too. Moments that meant nothing on their own, but that I keep turning over now, looking for the shape of the truth hidden inside them. The way Mark always insisted on being the one to check the mail. The way he'd get quietly irritated if I mentioned wanting to sit down together and go over our savings goals, always saying he'd already handled it and steering the conversation somewhere else. The way, 2 years ago, I'd found a receipt in his jacket pocket for a lunch meeting at a restaurant I knew for a fact was well outside what our budget allowed for eating out, and when I asked about it, he said a client had reimbursed him. I believed him. Of course I believed him. He was my husband. I found the shoebox because of something almost embarrassingly mundane. Mark had gone on a work trip to Denver, 3 nights, standard enough that I didn't think twice about it. I was reorganizing our bedroom closet, something I'd been meaning to do for months, pulling out old shoes and winter coats we hadn't touched in years, when I found a shoebox pushed all the way to the back corner, behind a stack of file boxes from Mark's old accounting job. It wasn't even hidden well. That's the part that still gets me. It wasn't buried in a storage unit or locked in a safe deposit box. It was in our closet, 18 inches from where I hung my scrubs every single night. Close enough that I'd probably brushed past it 1,000 times without a second thought. I almost didn't open it. I remember my hand hovering over the lid for a second, some quiet instinct telling me to just set it aside and keep organizing. I wish sometimes I had listened to that instinct, and other times I'm so grateful I didn't. Inside were bank statements from an account at a bank we didn't use for anything else. Monthly deposits, consistent, growing. I sat down on the closet floor with that shoebox in my lap and started doing math I didn't want to do. The account had been open for 11 years. The deposits started small, a few $100s a month, back when we were newly married, and I assumed every extra dollar was going toward our shared future. But they grew. By the time Emma was in middle school, Mark was putting away over $2,000 a month. By last year, it was closer to $412,000. I sat on that closet floor for almost an hour, statements spread around me like fallen leaves, and I felt something inside me go very, very still. Not angry yet, not even hurt yet. Just still, the way the air gets still right before a storm breaks. I remember staring at one particular statement, the month Emma was born, and doing the math on what that deposit could have paid for instead. Diapers, a crib. The maternity leave I'd cut short by 3 weeks because we needed the income. Because underneath the shock, a colder thought was forming, one I couldn't shake. If he lied about this, what else had he lied about? And if he'd been quietly building a fortune while I sacrificed my career, my time, my own small comforts for a family budget that apparently never needed tightening at all. What exactly had he been planning to do with that money? I thought about calling my sister right then. I had my phone in my hand, her contact pulled up, my thumb hovering over the call button, the same way it had hovered over that shoebox lid. But something stopped me. Some instinct told me that the moment I said it out loud to another person, it would become real in a way I wasn't ready for yet. I needed to sit with it first. I needed to understand what I was actually looking at. I didn't call him in Denver either. I didn't scream, didn't cry, didn't tell anyone yet. I photographed every single statement with my phone, page by page, my hands steadier than I expected them to be. Then I put every statement back exactly where I found it, back in the same order, the same folds, the same corner of the closet, and closed the closet door like nothing had happened. Because I needed to understand what I was actually dealing with before I let Mark know that I knew anything at all. I had no idea, sitting on that floor, that the shoebox was only the smallest piece of what my husband had been hiding from me. I had no idea that in less than a month, I would be sitting across from a divorce attorney, learning about a second account I hadn't even found yet, one that would make the $400,000 look like pocket change. I had no idea that the work trip to Denver wasn't entirely what he'd told me it was either, though it would take me another 2 weeks to understand exactly what that meant. But that night, all I knew was that the man who took my hands at our kitchen table and told me we couldn't afford my future had spent 13 years making sure I never found out what he could actually afford. And I was done being the only one in this marriage who didn't know the truth. Mark came home from Denver on a Thursday evening, wheeling his suitcase through the front door with the same easy smile he always wore, kissing my cheek, asking about the kids, dropping his laptop bag on the kitchen counter in the exact spot he always dropped it. I watched him move through our house like nothing in the world had changed, and I realized in that moment that I was a better actress than I'd ever given myself credit for, because I smiled back and asked how his flight was. Delayed 40 minutes out of Denver, he said, opening the fridge and pulling out a beer. Otherwise fine. Client dinners ran long, but we closed the account, so it was worth it. I nodded. I asked no follow-up questions. 3 weeks earlier, I would have. 3 weeks earlier, I would have wanted to hear about the client dinner, the hotel, the little details of his trip, because that's what you do when you love someone and you're interested in their life. But I had spent the 2 days since finding that shoebox teaching myself to be quiet, to watch, to listen for the gaps between what Mark said and what might actually be true. That night, after the kids were in bed, I lay awake next to him for a long time, listening to him breathe, staring at the ceiling, trying to decide what kind of person I wanted to be in this. Did I confront him immediately? Did I hire someone to dig deeper first? Did I talk to a lawyer before I said a single word to my own husband? I decided on the lawyer. I told myself it was just to understand my rights, just information, nothing final, nothing decided. But some part of me already knew that once I picked up that phone, I was choosing a direction I couldn't easily walk back from. I called Patricia Alvarez 3 days later, a family law attorney my coworker Denise had used during her own divorce 2 years earlier. Denise had said Patricia was tough, thorough, and didn't waste your money on conversations that didn't need to happen. I sat in the parking lot of the hospital on my lunch break, phone pressed to my ear, my voice shaking more than I expected it to as I explained what I'd found. "How long have the deposits been going into this account?" Patricia asked, her voice calm in a way that made me feel, for the first time in days, like I wasn't losing my mind. 11 years, based on the statements I saw. I don't know if it goes back further than that. And this account is in his name only? As far as I could tell, I didn't see my name on any of it. There was a pause on the line, the sound of a pen against paper. "Renee, I want you to understand something before we go any further. Depending on your state's laws, marital assets are typically split regardless of whose name is on the account, especially if the money was earned during the marriage. But the fact that he actively concealed it from you, that's significant. That's not just a financial issue. That could be considered financial fraud within the marriage, and courts don't look kindly on that kind of deception, especially when it's sustained and deliberate." I sat there in my car, air conditioning blowing weakly against the July heat, and felt something shift inside my chest. Fraud. She'd used the word fraud, and hearing someone else say it out loud, someone whose job it was to be precise about language, made it real in a way that sitting alone on my closet floor hadn't quite managed. "I need you to do something for me before our next conversation," Patricia continued. "I need you to gather as much documentation as you safely can, without tipping him off that anything is different. Bank statements, tax returns, pay stubs, anything financial you can find or photograph. Do not confront him yet. I know that's going to be hard. But the moment he knows you're aware of this, he has the opportunity to move money, hide it further, or come up with an explanation he's rehearsed. Right now, you have the advantage of surprise. Don't give that up before we're ready." I promised her I wouldn't. I hung up the phone, sat in that parking lot for another 10 minutes, just breathing, and then went back inside to finish my shift, delivering another woman's baby 6 hours later with hands that didn't shake at all. Because somehow I could hold an entire family's most important moment steady while my own family was quietly falling apart. The next 2 weeks were some of the strangest of my life. I became a detective in my own home. I learned to move through Mark's things with a kind of careful precision I didn't know I had. Waiting for him to shower, waiting for him to take the kids to practice, waiting for the narrow windows when the house was mine alone to search. I found the tax returns first, filed in a cabinet in his home office, 3 years' worth going back further than I expected. Our joint filings showed our combined income exactly as I'd always understood it. My nursing salary, his logistics salary, nothing unusual. But tucked behind those, in a separate folder labeled with nothing but a date range, I found a set of 199 forms. Consulting income. Mark had apparently been doing freelance financial consulting work on the side for years. Income that never once appeared in any conversation we'd ever had about money. Income that, once I added it up, came to nearly $60,000 in the last year alone. $60,000. The number sat in my chest like a stone. That was more than half of what I made in a full year of 12-hour shifts, night differentials, and holiday pay, and I hadn't known it existed. I thought about all the times I'd told Emma we couldn't afford something small. A school trip, new cleats, a birthday party at the trampoline park all her friends were going to. I thought about the year I skipped my dermatologist appointments. I thought about standing in the kitchen with my husband's hands wrapped around mine, being told gently, kindly, that we simply couldn't afford my future. I found something else too, something that made the whole picture tilt sideways in a way I hadn't anticipated. In the same cabinet behind the 1099s was a folder of email printouts. Mark still printed important things, an old habit from his accounting days that I'd always found a little charming. Most of the emails were mundane, consulting client correspondence, invoices, scheduling, but one email chain was different. It was between Mark and someone named Diane Whitfield, and the subject line read simply, Property Update, Cedar Ridge. I sat down on the floor of his office, the same way I'd sat on the closet floor 2 weeks earlier, and read through 11 months of correspondence about a piece of property in a town called Cedar Ridge, roughly 90 minutes from where we lived. The emails discussed permits, contractor bids, a construction timeline, and a closing date that had already passed 6 weeks ago. My husband had bought property. A house, based on the language in the emails, a house that was apparently already built, already closed on, already his, and I had never heard the name Cedar Ridge in my life. I photographed every page with hands that were no longer steady at all, and then I sat very still in his office chair, the late afternoon sun slanting through the blinds, and tried to make my mind work through what I was looking at. A hidden savings account, undisclosed consulting income, a house I knew nothing about. Each discovery felt like a door opening onto another door, and I had no idea how many more there were, or what waited behind the last one. I called Patricia that evening from my car in a grocery store parking lot. Groceries I hadn't bought yet because I couldn't make myself walk inside and shop for a family dinner I wasn't sure I could sit through. A property, Patricia repeated, and I could hear her writing again. Do you know if it's in his name alone, or if there's any indication of a co-owner? I don't know. The emails don't say. I don't even know why he'd need a second house. Patricia was quiet for a moment. Renee, I don't want to speculate ahead of the facts, and I want you to be careful not to either, at least not yet. There are a lot of reasons someone might purchase property secretly, and not all of them involve what you might be thinking. But I'll be honest with you. In my experience, when a spouse goes to this much effort to hide this much money and this much activity over this many years, it's rarely just about the money itself. There's usually a story behind it. I think it's time we brought in a forensic accountant, someone who can trace these accounts properly and tell us exactly what we're dealing with before you have to sit across from him and ask any questions. I agreed. I would have agreed to almost anything by that point, desperate for someone with more expertise than me to make sense of the pieces scattered in front of me. That night, I made dinner like everything was normal. Chicken and rice, Caleb's favorite, because it was Tuesday and Tuesday was Caleb's night to pick. Emma talked about a group project for her English class. Mark asked Caleb about baseball practice and actually listened to the answer, nodding along, asking a follow-up question about his pitching coach. I watched him across the table, this man I had built an entire life with, laughing at something Emma said, reaching over to steal a piece of broccoli off Caleb's plate just to make him laugh, and I felt a grief so sharp and sudden that I had to excuse myself to the bathroom halfway through dinner, running the water so no one would hear me cry for the second time in 3 weeks over a discovery he still didn't know I'd made. Because here was the thing I couldn't stop thinking about, sitting on the edge of our bathtub with my face in my hands. This was still the same man who remembered how I took my coffee. The same man who cried at our wedding. The same man who burned the first pancake every Sunday and gave it away to a dog we'd never even owned, just for a laugh. I didn't know yet if he was a liar who had simply gotten good at wearing a loving husband's face, or if there was some other explanation buried somewhere in Cedar Ridge that I hadn't found yet. I splashed water on my face, checked my reflection until I looked normal enough to return to the table, and went back to finish dinner with my family, all four of us sitting there together, three of us with no idea that the fourth was quietly building a case that could end everything we knew. 2 days later, Patricia called me back with the name of a forensic accountant she trusted, a woman named Judith Park, who had apparently untangled far messier financial situations than mine. I scheduled a consultation for the following week, and I remember hanging up the phone and feeling, for the first time since finding that shoebox, something that wasn't just shock or grief. It was resolve. I didn't know yet what Judith would find when she started pulling threads on the Cedar Ridge property. I didn't know that the forensic trail would lead somewhere I hadn't even considered. Somewhere that had nothing to do with hidden savings or freelance income at all. I only knew that 3 weeks ago, I thought I understood my marriage completely. And now I was building a file folder of evidence against the man sleeping beside me every night. A man who still had no idea that his wife had learned to lie just as convincingly as he had. That Friday, Mark came home early from work, something he never did, walked into the kitchen where I was chopping vegetables for dinner, and said, "Renee, we need to talk about something. Can you sit down?" And for one long, suspended second, my heart stopped completely, certain that somehow, after everything I'd done to be careful, he already knew. I set the knife down on the cutting board slower than I needed to, buying myself a second to arrange my face into something that looked like nothing more than mild curiosity. "Sure," I said. "What's going on?" Mark pulled out a chair at the kitchen table, the same chair he'd sat in 3 years earlier when he told me we couldn't afford my nurse practitioner program. And for one wild, terrible moment, I almost laughed at the symmetry of it. He gestured for me to sit across from him. I dried my hands on the dish towel and sat, my heart hammering so hard I was certain he could hear it. "I got some news at work today," he said, and I watched his face carefully, looking for the tell, the crack, the moment where the mask slipped, and he admitted he'd found out I'd been photographing his files and calling divorce attorneys from grocery store parking lots. But his expression stayed steady, almost excited, in a way that didn't match the dread pooling in my stomach. "They're offering me a regional director position," he said. "It would mean more travel, probably 2 trips a month instead of the occasional one. But Renee, it's a real jump. 6 figures, finally, after all these years of grinding through the mid-level stuff." I sat there for a second, letting the words rearrange themselves into something that made sense. He wasn't talking about the shoebox. He wasn't talking about Cedar Ridge. He was talking about a promotion, sitting across from me with genuine excitement in his eyes. A man asking his wife to be happy for him, completely unaware that she already knew he'd been quietly making 6 figures on the side for who knew how long. "That's wonderful," I heard myself say. And the strange thing was, some small, stubborn part of me still meant it, still felt an old reflexive pride in him, even as the rest of me cataloged the moment as one more piece of a performance I could no longer fully trust. When would it start? Not for a couple months. "I wanted you to know first, though," before gave them an answer. He reached across the table and took my hand. The same gesture, the same warm pressure of his fingers I'd felt 1,000 times before. And for just a moment, I let myself remember what it used to mean before I knew what I knew now. This could change things for us. Really change things. I almost said it then. I almost said, "Things have already changed, Mark. I just haven't told you yet." But I thought of Patricia's voice in my ear. "Don't give up your advantage before we're ready." And I swallowed the words back down and squeezed his hand instead and told him I was proud of him. That night I lay awake long after he'd fallen asleep, staring at the ceiling, turning the conversation over and over. Regional director, more travel, 2 trips a month instead of 1. I thought about Cedar Ridge, 90 minutes away, close enough to reach easily, far enough to stay hidden. I thought about the word Patricia had used, fraud. And underneath that word, quieter, uglier, a second word I hadn't let myself think yet, one that had been circling at the edges of my mind since I first read the name Diane Whitfield in that email chain. Affair. I met with Judith Park, the forensic accountant, the following Tuesday, in a small office above a dry cleaner's that smelled faintly of starch and coffee. Judith was younger than I expected, sharp-eyed, with the kind of calm efficiency that made me feel instantly like I was in capable hands. I handed over everything I had. The photographed bank statements, the 1099 forms, the Cedar Ridge emails. My hands didn't shake this time. Somewhere in the last month, I had gotten good at this. "Give me 2 weeks," Judith said, flipping through the printed pages with quick, practiced movements. "I'll trace the account origins, cross-reference the consulting income against his reported taxes, and see what I can find on the property. If there's more, Renee, I'll find it. This is what I do." The 2 weeks that followed were the longest of my life, and also, strangely, some of the most normal. Mark accepted the regional director position. We celebrated with a dinner out, the kids ordering dessert they didn't need, Mark raising a toast to new beginnings. A phrase that landed so differently in my ears than it did in his that I had to excuse myself again, this time to the restaurant bathroom, where I stood gripping the edge of the sink until the wave passed. I kept working my shifts, I kept making dinner. I kept being, on the surface, exactly the wife I had always been, while underneath, I was building a case, piece by piece, against the man I'd shared a bed with for 13 years. Judith called on a Thursday afternoon while I was between patients, ducking into a supply closet at the hospital to take the call, my back against a shelf of IV bags. "I need you to sit down for this," Judith said, and something in her voice made my stomach drop before she'd even started. "I'm at work. I can't exactly sit." "Okay, then just brace yourself." I heard papers shuffling on her end. The Cedar Ridge property. It's a single-family home, built about a year and a half ago, purchased outright, no mortgage, for $310,000. The deed lists Mark as the sole owner. But Renee, the utility accounts for that property, the water, the electric, they're not in his name. Whose name are they in? Diane Whitfield. I closed my eyes. There it was. The word I hadn't let myself think, now sitting in the air between us, spoken by someone else, someone whose job was facts, not speculation. "I did some further digging," Judith continued, gentler now, clearly aware of what she was handing me. "Diane Whitfield is 34. She works remotely as a marketing consultant. Public records show she's lived at the Cedar Ridge address for approximately 14 months. I also found something else. Property tax records show a name change, filed 8 months ago. Diane Whitfield was previously Diane Whitfield Marsh. She finalized a divorce 11 months ago. 11 months. The same general window as the property purchase. I stood in that supply closet, surrounded by boxes of gauze and saline, and did math I never wanted to do, counting backward through years of family vacations we couldn't afford, dermatologist appointments I'd skipped, a graduate program I'd given up. All of it while my husband was, at some point in that timeline, building a second life with another woman in a house he'd paid for in cash. "There's more," Judith said. "The consulting income, the $60,000 a year, it's real work, but it's inconsistent with the volume he's claiming. Based on the invoices I found, roughly 40% of what he's reporting as consulting fees appears to actually be transfers from a business account registered to a company called Whitfield Marketing Solutions. Renee, I think your husband may not just be having an affair. I think he may be helping her run a business, using money that should be part of your marital assets. And I think he's been doing it for at least a year, possibly longer." I don't remember exactly what I said back to her. I remember thanking her, telling her I'd call Patricia, hanging up the phone, and standing very still in that supply closet for what felt like a long time before a nurse I worked with, Angela, opened the door looking for extra tubing, and found me standing there with my back against the shelf and tears running silently down my face. "Renee, hey, what's wrong?" I couldn't answer her. I just shook my head and let her pull me into a hug, right there among the IV bags and gauze, and cried the kind of crying that comes from somewhere so deep it doesn't feel like it belongs to just one moment, but to every small sacrifice and quiet lie stacked up over 13 years, finally collapsing under its own weight all at once. I called Patricia that evening from my car, the same parking spot I'd used so many times over the past month that it had started to feel like my second home. "I want to move forward," I told her, my voice steadier than I expected. "I want the divorce filed. I want everything documented before he has any idea what's coming." "I understand," Patricia said. "But Renee, I need to be honest with you about something important. Given the scale of what Judith has found, the hidden savings, the undisclosed income, and now what appears to be marital assets funneled into supporting another household, this isn't going to be a quiet, simple filing. This is going to be a fight. He has significant motivation to obscure or dispute what we've found, And men in his position sometimes get aggressive when they realize they've been caught. I want you to be prepared for that. I thought about the man who had cried at our wedding, the man who burned pancakes on purpose and gave them to an imaginary dog just to hear Caleb laugh. The man who, 3 weeks ago, had reached across our kitchen table and asked me to be proud of him. I'm prepared, I said, and I meant it, even though some small, exhausted part of me wondered if anyone could ever really be prepared for the moment their entire life quietly detonates. We agreed that I would file within the next 10 days, once Patricia had everything organized and Judith had finished a final pass on the financial records. I would need to secure copies of everything, close nothing, tip nothing, and wait for the moment when Mark would be served, ideally somewhere that limited his ability to react in front of the children. I drove home that night in a strange, hollowed-out calm, the kind that settles in after you've cried everything out, and there's simply nothing left to feel for a while. When I walked through the door, Mark was in the living room with Caleb, helping him with a school project, a poster board covered in glued-on photographs and marker labels about the water cycle. Emma was upstairs on a video call with a friend, her laughter drifting down the staircase. For one aching moment, I stood in the doorway and just watched them, my husband and my son, heads bent together over a project about evaporation and rain, and I let myself grieve, quietly and completely, for the family I had believed we were. "Hey," Mark said, glancing up and catching my expression. "You okay? Rough shift?" "Long one," I said, and it wasn't even a lie. I went upstairs, showered, and sat on the edge of our bed for a long time afterward, looking at the closet where this had all begun, that shoebox still sitting exactly where I'd found it, still holding its 11 years of secrets. In 10 days, Mark would be served divorce papers, and everything I had carefully held together, the calm dinners, the normal conversations, the performance of a wife who suspected nothing, would finally be allowed to fall apart. But 2 days before Patricia had planned to file, everything changed again, in a way none of us saw coming. I got a phone call at 11 o'clock at night, while Mark was asleep beside me, from a number I didn't recognize. It was Diane Whitfield, and she was crying so hard I could barely understand her first words. "You need to know what he's really been doing," she said, "before it's too late for both of us."